In the 1970s, a high school graduate in Michigan could walk straight from the auditorium stage into a Ford, General Motors, or Chrysler plant and expect to earn enough for a new suburban home, a family car out front, and summers spent on the lakes. 3 shifts ran around the clock. Union contracts promised rising wages and secure futures. The state seemed untouchable, its confidence forged in factory steel. But beneath the steady rhythm of shift sirens was an undercurrent that would change everything. Why did Michigan once feel so unshakable, and what signs did nearly everyone miss? The day began long before sunrise for thousands across Michigan. At Ford's River Rouge complex, the first shift filed through steel gates, time cards in hand, boots echoing on concrete. The air inside was thick with the scent of hot metal and machine oil, punctuated by the clang of conveyor chains and the staccato hiss of welding torches. Overhead lights burned bright, turning night into perpetual daylight. Workers lined up along the moving belt, each assigned a narrow task, fastening a bolt, fitting a door, checking a weld over and over, minute after minute. The choreography was relentless. A car body passed every 50 seconds. To keep pace, hands learned their own rhythm, muscle memory taking over as the hours blurred. 3 shifts kept the line in motion around the clock. At shift change, parking lots overflowed as one wave of workers clocked out and another arrived, lunch pails swinging, thermoses tucked under arms. Some came straight from high school, others with decades behind them, but all wore the uniform of denim and work shirts, names stitched in red above the pocket. Overtime was common. A foreman might call for extra hands to cover a sick-out or a rush order, and the promise of a bigger paycheck was hard to refuse. On the line, overtime meant more than just money. It was a ticket to the things that defined stability, a down payment on a house, a second car, a week at a cottage up north. Breaks arrived by the clock, a brief escape to the cafeteria or a smoke outside, but the line never truly stopped. Even lunch was measured in minutes, and the hum of machinery seeped through every wall. The work was repetitive, sometimes numbing, but it carried a quiet dignity. A union card in your wallet meant a steady wage, health insurance, and the promise of a pension. Pay stubs showed deductions for benefits that many Americans only dreamed about. By the end of the week, the numbers on those checks told a simple story. One income could buy a home in Warren or Livonia, cover a new Chevy in the driveway, and still leave enough for a family vacation. For many, the routine of clocking in and out felt less like a grind and more like a guarantee. The factories ran on schedule, and so did life outside their walls. That steady rhythm was the backbone of communities, and a steady wage meant more than money, it meant possibility. Keys in hand, a factory worker stepped from his car onto the driveway of a new ranch house in Warren or Livonia. The lawn, still patchy in places, promised weekends of mowing and quiet pride. For $28,000, maybe $32,000, a 3-bedroom home with a brick front and a 2-car garage became the reward for years on the line. Mortgage papers sat in a drawer. The mortgage ran for 30 years at a fixed rate, sometimes with help from a VA or FHA loan. The down payment, often saved from overtime and holiday shifts, left enough for a washer-dryer, a color television, and the station wagon that would soon fill the garage. Inside, the kitchen hummed with the sound of a pressure cooker and the smell of pot roast. A single income, usually from the plant, covered the mortgage, groceries, and a new set of appliances. The second car, a used Chevy or Ford, waited for the weekend. Most households ran on one paycheck. Mothers often stayed home, balancing budgets, packing lunches, and managing the household routine. Family albums from the era show kids in bell-bottoms and striped shirts, riding bikes between identical driveways, their parents waving from folding lawn chairs after dinner. Schools in these suburbs drew steady funding from local property taxes. New buildings rose brick and glass with playgrounds and ball fields. Teachers' salaries climbed, and parents debated which district offered the best shot at a college scholarship or a union apprenticeship. The promise felt real. A child could start in a kindergarten classroom with bright floors and end up years later with a diploma and a job offer from one of the big three. Backyards stretched behind the houses, separated by chain-link fences. Evenings brought the hiss of sprinklers and the scent of charcoal. Neighbors leaned over fences to talk about Tigers games or the best route to the new shopping mall. On weekends, families loaded up the station wagon for trips to Lake St. Clair or a cottage up north. Paid vacations, 2, sometimes 3 weeks, were a standard part of the contract, and many workers spent them fishing, boating, or fixing up the house. This was the rhythm of suburban Michigan in the 1970s. The house, the yard, the steady job, each piece fit together, building a sense of permanence. Even as the world beyond the subdivision shifted, daily life here felt stable. The hum of the plant echoed in backyard conversations, in the confidence that the next paycheck would arrive on time, and in the quiet certainty that these homes, these neighborhoods, would last. Flint's skyline was defined by the sprawl of Buick City, where General Motors dominated every block and nearly every paycheck. In the early 1970s, more than 30,000 people clocked in at General Motors plants across the city, fathers, sons, neighbors, all tied to the same shift whistles and union halls. The local paper tracked company news as closely as the weather. A slowdown in production meant quiet streets and empty diners. Prosperity here was measured in overtime hours and the hum of machinery echoing across neighborhoods. General Motors sponsored Little League teams, parades, and scholarships. In Flint, the car business wasn't just an employer, it was the air itself. Lansing's rhythm felt steadier, balanced between the auto plants and the steady presence of state government. Oldsmobile's assembly line shared the city with the Capitol Dome, and families sometimes split between public service and the factory floor. A civil servant might live next door to a line worker, their kids competing on the same soccer field. This mix brought a different kind of stability, where layoffs at the plant didn't always ripple through every household, and government jobs offered their own version of security. Grand Rapids moved to the clatter of furniture factories. Steelcase and Herman Miller drew thousands to the west side of the state, filling shifts with skilled hands and creative minds. Here, the pride of craftsmanship ran deep. Office chairs and desks built in Grand Rapids furnished banks and boardrooms across America. The city's downtown bustled with workers on lunch break, union meetings, and Friday night bowling leagues. While autos played a role, furniture was king, its influence visible in local sponsorships, civic projects, and a skyline dotted with brick warehouses and showrooms. Ann Arbor stood apart, shaped by the University of Michigan's sprawling campus and the constant churn of students, professors, and researchers. The city pulsed with lectures, protests, and late-night debates in coffee shops. Bookstores outnumbered car dealerships. Academic life insulated Ann Arbor from the booms and busts of industry, and its politics leaned left in a way that felt distinct from the rest of the state. Here the future was written in research grants and published papers, not union contracts or assembly quotas. Far to the north, the Upper Peninsula carved out its own identity. Winters arrived early and stayed late, burying towns in snow measured in feet. Mining and logging shaped the economy, but so did a stubborn resilience. Small towns along Lake Superior and deep forests fostered a community that prided itself on independence. The distances were vast, the winters harsh, and the sense of being apart from Lansing or Detroit was more than just geography. Local bars and churches doubled as gathering places, and the radio carried news from below the bridge, sometimes feeling a world away. From the factory towns of the south to the remote outposts of the north, Michigan's regions moved to their own rhythms. Each depended on industry, but each found its own way to build community, weather uncertainty, and define what prosperity meant. Beneath the shared banner of manufacturing, the state was a patchwork, each piece distinct, each one essential to the whole. By late June, highways across Michigan filled with station wagons loaded for the annual migration north. Each summer, thousands of families left the regular hum of the factories for the quiet promise of a lake cottage. Some drove 3 hours to Torch Lake or the sandy stretches near Traverse City, coolers packed and fishing poles lashed to the roof. The ritual had its own rhythm, vacation weeks scheduled by the plant, cottages rented or inherited, and a sense that the lakes belonged to everyone who had earned their time off. Diaries and family scrapbooks from the era count nearly 200,000 Michigan families making this trip each year, a mass exodus shaped by the factory calendar and the certainty of paid vacation. On the water, the days unfolded slowly. Mornings started with the slap of screen doors and the call of loons. Docks stretched into glassy coves where children learned to swim and parents cast for salmon. In the late 1960s and the early 1970s, the state launched an ambitious salmon stocking program, releasing millions of Chinook and coho into Lake Michigan and its tributaries. By the middle of the decade, anglers reeled in catches weighing 20 pounds or more, fueling a fishing boom that brought new life to small towns along the shore. Charter boats booked up months in advance, and local papers ran stories of record hauls. For many, the thrill of a salmon strike became as much a part of summer as the scent of sunscreen and the taste of sweet corn. Afternoons drifted by in a haze of boat rides and sunburn, with grills fired up for dinners of fresh-caught perch or lake trout. Cottages, often simple and drafty, filled with laughter and card games as dusk settled. The lakes offered a different kind of wealth, one measured in time, not money. Evenings ended with the steady hum of crickets, windows open to the breeze off the water. The sense of abundance was quiet but real, built on the confidence that a year's hard work on the line had paid for these weeks of freedom. Then, as September approached, families packed up and pointed south. The first hint of cold crept in, and Michigan's other season took hold. Snow arrived early in the Upper Peninsula and along the western lakeshore, sometimes piling up in drifts before Halloween. By January, towns like Houghton and Marquette could see over 200 inches in a single winter. In Grand Rapids and Muskegon, snowblowers became as essential as lawn mowers. Clearing a driveway was a daily ritual, and the sound of plows scraping pavement echoed before dawn. Winter demanded stamina. Windshields froze solid overnight, and school closings scrolled across the bottom of the morning news. Still, there was a certain pride in enduring it. Families bundled up for sledding or ice fishing, and neighborhoods gathered for hockey games on frozen ponds. The same wages that bought summer at the lake also paid for snow tires, insulated boots, and the patience to wait out storms. For Michiganders, the contrast between seasons was more than weather. It was identity, a cycle of reward and resilience that shaped the year and defined what it meant to call this place home. In October 1973, drivers across Michigan pressed their luck against empty gas gauges and the new rules pinned to station doors. The odd-numbered license plate system, announced by state officials, dictated when you could buy fuel, odd-numbered plates on odd days, even on even days. By dawn, lines of cars curled around city blocks in Detroit and Flint, their engines idling in the cold. Some waited 2, even 3 hours for a chance at the pump. Tempers flared as stations ran dry before noon, and handwritten signs warned of 10-gallon limits. Police ticketed those who broke the rationing order. For many, the daily routine of driving a Ford or Chevy, once a symbol of pride, became a source of frustration. Dealerships watched as their lots filled with unsold, full-size sedans and pickups. State energy memos recorded sales drops of up to 30% in late 1973, with some dealers reporting inventory piling up week by week. The Big Three's latest models, engineered for power and comfort, suddenly seemed out of step. In living rooms and union halls, talk turned to miles per gallon. Neighbors compared notes on which cars could squeeze the most from a rationed tank. Japanese imports, once a curiosity, began to draw attention for their efficiency. But most Michiganders still clung to their American brands, even as the first doubts crept in. The oil shock did not bring the plants to a halt. It did something new. It made the future feel less certain, and it made the old routines harder to trust. Motown's sound poured from radios and record players across Michigan, a living pulse that tied factory towns and city blocks together. Marvin Gaye's What's Going On reached number 2 on the charts in 1971, its questions echoing through neighborhoods facing new uncertainties. Stevie Wonder's Living for the City and the Temptations. Papa Was a Rolling Stone spun stories of hope and hardship rooted in the streets of Detroit. By mid-decade, Bob Seger's Night Moves in Main Street captured the nostalgia and grit of Michigan nights, blue-collar pride woven into every verse. Music gave voice to the optimism that still lingered, but it also hinted at the pressures building beneath the surface. As the decade wore on, the soundtrack of Michigan life played against a changing backdrop. Census records logged a steady exodus from Detroit, almost 300,000 residents gone by the end of the 1970s. Street after street emptied out, leaving behind vacant homes and shuttered storefronts. For those who stayed, the city's familiar rhythms grew quieter. The loss was visible, but for many, the suburbs and factories still promised security. Pollution cast its own shadow. In the fall of 1969, the Rouge River caught fire near the Ford complex, flames fed by decades of oil and chemical waste. The blaze drew headlines, but even after the fire was out, the water ran thick and dark. In the years that followed, new environmental rules forced factories to reckon with their impact. Cleanup was slow, and the scars remained. Inside the plants, change arrived in the form of silent machines. By 1974, pilot programs at Ford and GM introduced robotic arms to the assembly line. Early memos described these as tools for efficiency, but on the floor, workers watched as machines took over tasks once done by hand. Automation promised progress, yet it also stirred quiet worry about the future. The music, the pride, the rituals of daily life, they all persisted, but the sense of certainty was no longer absolute. Michigan's promise in the 1970s was simple: one income, a home, steady work. It now feels almost mythic. As median home prices outpace wages and secure factory jobs shrink nationwide, the era's certainty becomes today's nostalgia. The state's story reminds us economic stability is not guaranteed, and what feels permanent can change within a generation. What will define security for us now? Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts below.